454, Chapters 74, 75, and 76 of the Count of Monte Cristo. Book Talk begins at 6:04.
Welcome to Craftlit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 454, Jet Set. This episode of Craftlit is brought to you by Jet.com, where prices drop as you shop. And also our lovely patrons over at patreon.com/Craftlit. We couldn't do it without you. Thank you. Well, hello. How are you? I hope you are well. I will have come back the night before you hear this, having spent a week being trained for the next leg of the gig that I've been doing outside of Craftlit. And that means I am recording this well in advance of the moment you hear it. So if you called in or wrote during the week, I'm sorry I didn't get it in time, but time shifting being what it is, you haven't sent me the email or the voicemail yet, so it'll have to wait until next week. Sorry about that. But you probably noticed at the beginning of this episode that we have a brand new sponsor for this week, Jet.com. I don't know if you've heard of them before, but now you have, and that is a reason enough to go and check them out. It's an interesting shopping site because one of the things that they excel at is shipping cold things, like fresh things, produce, cheese, things like that. And I would have thought that that would have made everything quite a bit more expensive. But like some of the big box stores where we have learned that buying in bulk makes sense, Jet.com works somewhat the same way, but in a very online fashion. I have taken some screenshots actually of my browser window as I shopped because I was able to find things that I cannot find in my local grocery store that I've been actually looking for a really long time. Unbleached parchment paper for baking and 2-gallon Ziploc bags. I'm able to find the 1 gallons here, but not the 2 gallons, which is kind of strange because it's not like we have a rinky-dink grocery store, but be that as it may, Jet.com absolutely saved the day when it came to finding what are, for me, some hard to find items. The other thing that Jet.com did is show to me just how overpriced some of the things are in my local store. There is a cheese that my husband and boys fell in love with years ago called Dubliner. It's a sharp cheddar. It's very good. And it is really expensive in our store here. It was half of what I pay in the local store on Jet.com. But it wasn't just the cheese that really made the shopping experience great. Aside from the fact that the site is easy to navigate and very, very clear, there are other ways to save money on Jet.com because the prices that you see when you first click on an item and say, okay, add to my cart, those prices can still go down depending on what other things you buy. And you can reduce the price even further if you agree to pay with a debit card, which I assume has something to do with the fact that debit card service fees are less than credit card service fees. I'm not entirely sure, but that would make sense. Or if you agree to pay for shipping if you return a specific item. Now, I had many items that I've known and have never had a problem with, and I was able to put down, I'm not going to return this, no big deal. So that dropped the price. There were other places, however, where I wasn't sure it was a new thing I was getting. So I kind of wanted to check it out first. And in that case, the Jet.com site guarantees free returns within 30 days, and you get free shipping on orders over $35. I was fairly certain when this offer came in that with details like this, there would be a membership fee that you would have to pay up front, even a one-time membership fee. And that was not true. There is no membership. There is no annual fee. You don't have to pay extra for anything like that. Almost everything shows up at your doorstep within 2 days. thinking back to when I was homesick with pneumonia, how much easier would my life have been if I could have opened jet.com on my phone and done my shopping in bed while, gasping for breath, and then having everything show up on my doorstep 2 days later. I mean, aside from emergency essentials, this is now my go-to lifesaver. So if you're interested in trying out jet.com, they are offering Craftlit listeners 20% off your first 2 orders over $35. So you go to jet.com and then pick out all the things you want to buy and then enter Craftlit as a promo code at checkout. Terms and conditions apply, of course. This is a big company. So when you go through the checkout, you'll see a link to terms and conditions. If you want to read that, always a good idea, you will be able to find those details. So jet.com, promo code Craftlit, and let's get to the Count of Monte Cristo. Well, this week is going to be another big episode. If you didn't already notice the time code on this file, now you know. That is because the 3 chapters that you're going to hear today, 2 of them go together very clearly. But if we were playing some of these things are not like the other, the third one you're going to think, wow, why did Heather include that one? It will make sense soon, but it will make a lot more sense when you listen to next week's chapters, because those are a unified, cohesive whole. And it would have been really weird to put today's last episode with next week's first episode. Now, there are only a couple of things in today's chapters that are that kind of offhanded sub-reference that people reading during Dumas' day would have understood just offhand that we probably don't. A couple of those are, there is a reference. One of the characters makes a kind of a laundry list of locations. It starts with Marengo and it ends with Austerlitz. Those are places where Napoleon had some of his biggest victories in 1800 and in 1805. Now, me bringing up Napoleon at this late date in our story should indicate that a lot of the occurrences from the first half, not even the first half, the first quarter of the book, are going to come back into play in today's chapters. And that is true. So put on your memory cap, because pieces are going to start to fall into place and details are going to start to make more sense. Things that we had hints of before get explained. And along with those explanations, we also have things like one character in talking about the deaths of Saint-Marin and his wife will make a little witticism, not in front of Valentine, by the way. And one little throwaway line is Eorus, E-O-R-U-S, which means I'm going to the country. And the footnote in the more recent translation said that nobody's been able to find this in Voltaire's writing. It's attributed to him, as Voltaire said, kind of thing. Nobody's been able to find it. But one translator, earlier translator, had noticed that there was an anecdote that Voltaire tells in his Century of Louis XIV, when he remembers having asked the Abbé de Saint-Pierre how he considered his impending death, to which the abbé replied, like a journey to the country. That's all anybody could figure out. It is a reference to death being a trip to someplace nicer. And that's it. You're going to hear mention of the Greek poet from 6th century BC, Sappho, from the island of Lesbos. Her name has been linked to passionate female love forever. She even got censured when she was writing. So this goes way back. And along with the mention of Sappho, there's a mention of Minerva. Minerva is the Roman version of the Greek goddess Athena, the goddess of wisdom. She is one of the virgin goddesses, all about chastity. And evidently, in some mythology, they talk about the breastplate, the kind of warrior plate that she wears, being used to ward off tender looks to protect her from desire, which I kind of dug, especially fun having just seen the movie Wonder Woman. So that was kind of fun. These are two not very subtle clues about a particular character's love interest. And once again, I say, wow, you can sure tell this is not a British novel from this time period. 1844, 173 years ago. And yes, this is pre-Dickens. I continue to marvel at that for reasons like this. The only other thing to know before heading into today's chapters is there is another kind of semi-self-serving reference by Dumas. I love it when he does this. He mentions a character named Antonia, and there's some reference to singing killing her. So this goes back to an E.T.A. Hoffmann story. And remember, way back, he had mentioned a book of stories by E.T.A. Hoffmann, which Dumas had just translated from German into French. So here's another one of those stories. It's a story about a woman, Antonia, who has a beautiful voice, but her doctor forbids her to sing, saying that it will kill her if she does. So she takes up the violin instead. Then one night her father dreams that he hears her voice singing, and the next morning finds her dead in her room. So that is the origin of that reference. It's a little thing, but if you have never read E.T.A. Hoffmann and that sounds like the kind of story that you'd like, I'm sure you can still find Dumas' version in French, but there are also translations into English now as well. All right, so that is it. Here we go with chapters 74, 75, and 76 of The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas.
Chapter 74. The Villefort Family Vault. 2 days after, a considerable crowd was assembled towards 10 o'clock in the morning around the door of Monsieur de Villefort's house, and a long file of mourning coaches and private carriages extended along the Faubourg Saint-Honoré and the Rue de la Pépinière. Among them was one of a very singular form, which appeared to have come from a distance. It was a kind of covered wagon, painted black, and was one of the first to arrive. Inquiry was made, and it was ascertained that by a strange coincidence this carriage contained the corpse of the Marquis de Saint-Méran, and that those who had come thinking to attend one funeral would follow two. Their number was great. The Marquis de Saint-Méran was one of the most zealous and faithful dignitaries of Louis XVIII and King Charles X, had preserved a great number of friends, and these, added to the personages whom the usages of society gave Villefort a claim on, formed a considerable body. Due information was given to the authorities, and permission obtained that the two funerals should take place at the same time. A second hearse, decked with the same funereal pomp, was brought to Monsieur de Villefort's door, and the coffin removed into it from the post-wagon. The two bodies were to be interred in the cemetery of Père-Lachaise, where Monsieur de Villefort had long since had a tomb prepared for the reception of his family. The remains of poor Renée were already deposited there, and now, after 10 years of separation, her father and mother were to be reunited with her. The Parisians, always curious, always affected by funereal display, looked on with religious silence, while the splendid procession accompanied to their last abode two of the number of the old aristocracy, the greatest protectors of commerce and sincere devotees to their principles. In one of the mourning coaches, Beauchamp, Debray, and Château Renaud were talking of the very sudden death of the Marchioness. "I saw Madame de Saint-Méran only last year at Marseilles, when I was coming back from Algiers," said Château Renaud. "She looked like a woman destined to live to be 100 years old, from her apparent sound health and great activity of mind and body. How old was she?" "France assured me," replied Albert, "that she was 66 years old. But she has not died of old age, but of grief. It appears that since the death of the Marquis, which affected her very deeply, she has not completely recovered her reason." "But of what disease, then, did she die?" asked Debray. "It is said to have been a congestion of the brain, or apoplexy, which is the same thing, is it not? Nearly. It is difficult to believe that it was apoplexy, said Beauchamp. Madame de Saint-Méran, whom I once saw, was short, of slender form, and of a much more nervous than sanguine temperament. Grief could hardly produce apoplexy in such a constitution as that of Madame de Saint-Méran. At any rate, said Albert, whatever disease or doctor may have killed her, Monsieur de Villefort, or rather Mademoiselle Valentine, or still rather our friend Franz, inherits a magnificent fortune, amounting, I believe, to 80,000 livres per annum. And this fortune will be doubled at the death of the old Jacobin, Noirtier. This is a tenacious old grandfather, said Beauchamp. Tenacem probositi virum. I think he must have made an agreement with death to outlive all his heirs, and he appears likely to succeed. He resembles the old conventionalist of '93, who said to Napoleon in 1814, "You bend because your empire is a young stem, weakened by rapid growth. Take the Republic for a tutor. Let us return with renewed strength to the battlefield, and I promise you 500,000 soldiers, another Marengo, and a second Austerlitz. Ideas do not become extinct, sire. They slumber sometimes, but only revive the stronger before they sleep entirely." Ideas and men appeared the same to him. On one thing only puzzles me, namely how Franz d'Épinay will like a grandfather who cannot be separated from his wife. But where is Franz? In the first carriage with Monsieur de Villefort, who considered him already as one of the family. Such was the conversation in almost all the carriages. These two sudden deaths, so quickly following each other, astonished everyone. But no one suspected the terrible secret which Monsieur d'Avrigny had communicated in his nocturnal walk to Monsieur de Villefort. They arrived in about an hour at the cemetery. The weather was mild, but dull, and in harmony with the funeral ceremony. Among the groups which flocked towards the family vault, Château Renaud recognized Morel, who had come alone in a cabriolet, and walked silently along the path all bordered with yew trees. "You here?" said Château Renaud, passing his arm through the young captain's. "Are you a friend of Villefort's? How is it that I have never met you at his house?" "I am no acquaintance of Monsieur de Villefort's," answered Morel, "but I was of Madame de Saint-Méran." Albert came up to them at this moment with Franz. "The time and place are but ill-suited for an introduction," said Albert. "But we are not superstitious, Monsieur Morel. Allow me to present to you Monsieur Franz d'Épinay, a delightful travelling companion with whom I made the tour of Italy. My dear Franz, Monsieur Maximilian Morel, an excellent friend I have acquired in your absence, and whose name you will hear me mention every time I make an allusion to affection, wit, or amiability." Morel hesitated for a moment. He feared it would be hypocritical to accost in a friendly manner the man whom he was tacitly opposing, but his oath and the gravity of the circumstances recurred to his memory. He struggled to conceal his emotion, and bowed to Franz. "Mademoiselle de Villefort is in deep sorrow, is she not?" said Debray to Franz. "Extremely," replied he. "She looked so pale this morning, I scarcely knew her." These apparently simple words pierced Morel to the heart. This man had seen Valentine and spoken to her. The young and high-spirited officer required all his strength of mind to resist breaking his oath. He took the arm of Château Renaud and turned towards the vault, where the attendants had already placed the two coffins. "This is a magnificent habitation," said Beauchamp, looking towards the mausoleum. "A summer and winter palace. You will in turn enter it, my dear Épinay, for you will soon be numbered as one of the family. I, as a philosopher, should like a little country house, a cottage down there under the trees, without so many free stones over my poor body. In dying, I will say to those around me what Voltaire wrote to Piron, Eorus, and all will be over. But come, Franz, take courage. Your wife is an heiress. Indeed, Beauchamp, you are unbearable. Politics has made you laugh at everything, and political men have made you disbelieve everything. But when you have the honour of associating with ordinary men, and the pleasure of leaving politics for a moment, try to find your affectionate heart, which you leave with your stick when you go to the chamber. But tell me, said Beauchamp, what is life? Is it not a hole in death's anteroom? I am prejudiced against Beauchamp, said Albert, drawing Franz away, and leaving the former to finish his philosophical dissertation with Debray. The Villefort vault formed a square of white stones about 20 feet high. An interior partition separated the two families, and each apartment had its entrance door. Here were not, as in other tombs, ignoble drawers, one above another, where thrift bestows its dead and labels them like specimens in a museum. All that was visible within the bronze gates was a gloomy-looking room, separated by a wall from the vault itself. The two doors before mentioned were in the middle of this wall, and enclosed the Villefort and Saint-Méran coffins. Their grief might freely expend itself, without being disturbed by the trifling loungers who came from a picnic party to visit Père Lachaise, or by lovers who made it their rendezvous. The two coffins were placed on trestles previously prepared to their reception in the right-hand crypt belonging to the Saint-Méran family. Villefort, Franz, and a few near relatives alone entered the sanctuary. As the religious ceremonies had all been performed at the door, and there was no address given, the party all separated. Château Renaud, Albert, and Morel went one way, and Debray and Beauchamp the other. Franz remained with Monsieur de Villefort at the gate of the cemetery. Morel made an excuse to wait. He saw Franz and Monsieur de Villefort get into the same mourning coach, and thought this meeting foreboded evil. He then returned to Paris, and although in the same carriage with Château Renaud and Albert, he did not hear one word of their conversation. As Franz was about to take leave of Monsieur de Villefort, "When shall I see you again?" said the latter. "At what time you please, sir," replied Franz. "As soon as possible." "I am at your command, sir. Shall we return together?" "If not unpleasant to you?" "On the contrary, I shall feel much pleasure." Thus the future father and son-in-law stepped into the same carriage, and Morel, seeing them pass, became uneasy. Villefort and Franz returned to the Faubourg Saint-Honoré. The procureur, without going to see either his wife or his daughter, went at once to his study, and offering the young man a chair, "Monsieur d'Épinay," said he, "allow me to remind you at this moment, which is perhaps not so ill-chosen as at first sight may appear, for obedience to the wishes of the departed is the first offering which should be made at their tomb. Allow me then to remind you of the wish expressed by Madame de Saint-Méran on her deathbed, that Valentine's wedding might not be deferred. You know the affairs of the deceased are in perfect order, and her will bequeaths to Valentine the entire property of the Saint-Méran family. The notary showed me the documents yesterday, which will enable us to draw up the contract immediately. You may call on the notary, Monsieur Deschamps, Place Beauvau, Faubourg Saint-Honoré, and you have my authority to inspect those deeds." "Sir," replied Monsieur d'Épinay, "it is not, perhaps, the moment for Mademoiselle Valentine, who is in deep distress, to think of a husband. Indeed, I fear—" "Valentine will have no greater pleasure than that of fulfilling her grandmother's last injunctions. There will be no obstacle from that quarter, I assure you." "In that case," replied Franz, "as I shall raise none, you may make arrangements when you please. I have pledged my word, and shall feel pleasure and happiness in adhering to it." "Then," said Villefort, "nothing further is required. The contract was to have been signed 3 days since. We shall find it all ready and can sign it today." "But the morning," said Franz, hesitating. "Don't be uneasy on that score," replied Villefort. "No ceremony will be neglected in my house. Mademoiselle de Villefort may retire during the prescribed 3 months to her estate of Saint-Méran. I say hers, for she inherits it today. There, after a few days, if you like, the civil marriage shall be celebrated without pomp or ceremony. Madame de Saint-Méran wished her daughter should be married there. When that is over, you, sir, can return to Paris, while your wife passes the time of her mourning with her mother-in-law." "As you please, sir," said Franz. "Then," replied Monsieur de Villefort, "have the kindness to wait half an hour. Valentine shall come down into the drawing-room. I will send Monsieur Deschamps. We will read and sign the contract before we separate. And this evening Madame de Villefort shall accompany Valentine to her estate, where we will rejoin them in a week." "Sir," said Franz, "I have one request to make." "What is it?" "I wish Albert de Morcerf and Raoul de Châteaurenaud to be present at this signature. You know they are my witnesses." "Half an hour will suffice to apprise them. Will you go for them yourself, or shall you send?" "I prefer going, sir." "I shall expect you then in half an hour, Baron, and Valentine will be ready." Franz bowed and left the room. Scarcely had the door closed when Monsieur de Villefort sent to tell Valentine to be ready in the drawing-room in half an hour, as he expected the notary and Monsieur d'Épinay and his witnesses. The news caused a great sensation throughout the house. Madame de Villefort would not believe it, and Valentine was thunderstruck. She looked around for help, and would have gone down to her grandfather's room, but on the stairs she met Monsieur de Villefort, who took her arm and led her into the drawing-room. In the ante-room Valentine met Barrois, and looked despairingly at the old servant. A moment later Madame de Villefort entered the drawing-room with her little Edward. It was evident that she had shared the grief of the family, for she was pale and looked fatigued. She sat down, took Edward on her knees, and from time to time pressed this child, on whom her affections appeared centred, almost convulsively to her bosom. 2 carriages were soon heard to enter the courtyard. One was the notary's, the other that of Franz and his friends. In a moment the whole party was assembled. Valentine was so pale one might trace the blue veins from her temples, round her eyes and down her cheeks. Franz was deeply affected. Château and Albert looked at each other with amazement. The ceremony, which was just concluded, had not appeared more sorrowful than did that which was about to begin. Madame de Villefort had placed herself in the shadow behind a velvet curtain, and as she constantly bent over her child, it was difficult to read the expression of her face. Monsieur de Villefort was, as usual, unmoved. The notary, after having, according to the customary method, arranged the papers on the table, taken his place in an armchair, and raised his spectacles, turned towards Franz. "Are you Monsieur Franz de Quesnel, Baron d'Épinay?" asked he, although he knew it perfectly. "Yes, sir," replied Franz. The notary bowed. "I have then to inform you, sir, at the request of Monsieur de Villefort, that your projected marriage with Mademoiselle de Villefort has changed the feeling of Monsieur Noirtier towards his grandchild, and that he disinherits her entirely of the fortune he would have left her. Let me hasten to add," continued he, "that the testator, having only the right to alienate a part of his fortune, and having alienated it all, The will not bear scrutiny and is declared null and void." "Yes," said Villefort, "but I warn Monsieur d'Épinay that during my lifetime my father's will shall never be questioned, my position forbidding any doubt to be entertained." "Sir," said Franz, "I regret much that such a question has been raised in the presence of Mademoiselle Valentine. I have never inquired the amount of her fortune, which, however limited it may be, exceeds mine. My family has sought consideration in this alliance with Monsieur de Villefort. All I seek is happiness." Valentine imperceptibly thanked him, while two silent tears rolled down her cheeks. "Besides, sir," said Villefort, addressing himself to his future son-in-law, "excepting the loss of a portion of your hopes, this unexpected will not need to personally wound you. Monsieur Noirtier's weakness of mind sufficiently explains it. It is not because Mademoiselle Valentine is going to marry you that he is angry, but because she will marry. A union with any other would have caused him the same sorrow. Old age is selfish, sir, and Mademoiselle de Villefort has been a faithful companion to Monsieur Noirtier, which she cannot be when she becomes the Baroness d'Épinay. My father's melancholy state prevents our speaking to him on any subjects which the weakness of his mind would incapacitate him from understanding, and I am perfectly convinced that at the present time, although he knows that his granddaughter is going to be married, Monsieur Noirtier has ever forgotten the name of his intended grandson." Monsieur de Villefort had scarcely said this when the door opened and Barrois appeared. "Gentlemen," said he in a tone strangely firm for a servant speaking to his masters under such solemn circumstances, "Gentlemen, Monsieur Noirtier de Villefort wishes to speak immediately to Monsieur Franz de Quesnel, Baron d'Épinay." He, as well as the notary, that there might be no mistake in the person, gave all his titles to the bridegroom-elect. Villefort started. Madame de Villefort let her son slip from her knees. Valentine rose, pale and dumb as a statue. Albert and Château Renaud exchanged a second look, more full of amazement than the first. The notary looked at Villefort. "It is impossible," said the procureur. "Monsieur d'Épinay cannot leave the drawing-room at present." "It is at this moment," replied Barrois with the same firmness, "that Monsieur Noirtier, my master, wishes to speak on important subjects to Monsieur Franz d'Épinay." "Grandpapa Noirtier can speak now, then," said Edward with his habitual quickness. However, his remark did not make Madame de Villefort even smile. So much was every mind engaged, and so solemn was the situation. Astonishment was at its height. Something like a smile was perceptible on Madame de Villefort's countenance. Valentine instinctively raised her eyes, as if to thank heaven. "Pray go, Valentine," said Monsieur de Villefort, "and see what this new fancy of your grandfather's is." Valentine rose quickly, and was hastening joyfully towards the door, when Monsieur de Villefort altered his intention. "Stop," said he. "I will go with you." "Excuse me, sir," said Franz. "Since Monsieur Noirtier sent for me, I am ready to attend to his wish. Besides, I shall be happy to pay my respects to him, not having yet had the honour of doing so." "Pray, sir," said Villefort with marked uneasiness, "do not disturb yourself." "Forgive me, sir," said Franz in a resolute tone. "I would not lose this opportunity of proving to Monsieur Noirtier how wrong it would be of him to encourage feelings of dislike to me, which I am determined to conquer, whatever they may be, by my devotion." And without listening to Villefort, he arose and followed Valentine, who was running downstairs with the joy of a shipwrecked mariner who finds a rock to cling to. Monsieur de Villefort followed them. Château Renaud and Morcerf exchanged a third look of still increasing wonder. End of chapter 74. Chapter 75. A signed statement. Noirtier was prepared to receive them, dressed in black and installed in his armchair. When the three persons he expected had entered, he looked at the door, which his valet immediately closed. "Listen," whispered Villefort to Valentine, who could not conceal her joy. "If Monsieur Noirtier wishes to communicate anything which would delay your marriage, I forbid you to understand him." Valentine blushed, but did not answer. Villefort, approaching Noirtier, "Here is Monsieur Franz d'Épinay," said he. "You requested to see him. We have all wished for this interview, and I trust it will convince you how ill-informed are your objections to Valentine's marriage." Noirtier answered only by a look which made Villefort's blood run cold. He motioned to Valentine to approach. In a moment, thanks to her habit of conversing with her grandfather, she understood that he asked for a key. Then his eye was fixed on the drawer of a small chest between the windows. She opened the drawer and found a key, and understanding that was what he wanted, again watched his eyes, which turned towards an old secretary which had been neglected for many years, and was supposed to contain nothing but useless documents. "Shall I open the secretary?" asked Valentine. "Yes," said the old man. "And the drawers?" "Yes." "Those at the side?" "No." "The middle one?" "Yes." Valentine opened it and drew out a bundle of papers. "Is that what you wish for?" asked she. "No." She took successively all the other papers out till the drawer was empty. "But there are no more," said she. Noirtier's eye was fixed on the dictionary. "Yes, I understand, grandfather," said the young girl. He pointed to each letter of the alphabet. At the letter S, the old man stopped her. She opened and found the word secret. "Ah, is there a secret spring?" said Valentine. "Yes," said Noirtier. "And who knows it?" Noirtier looked at the door where the servant had gone out. "Barrois?" said she. "Yes." "Shall I call him?" "Yes." Valentine went to the door and called Barrois. Villefort's impatience during this scene made the perspiration roll from his forehead, and Franz was stupefied. The old servant came. "Barrois," said Valentine, "my grandfather has told me to open that drawer in the secretary, but there is a secret spring in it, which you know. Will you open it?" Barrois looked at the old man. "Obey," said Noirtier's intelligent eye. Barrois touched a spring, the false bottom came out, and they saw a bundle of papers tied with a black string. "Is that what you wish for?" said Barrois. "Yes." "Shall I give these papers to Monsieur de Villefort?" "No." "To Mademoiselle Valentine?" "No." "To Monsieur Franz d'Épinay?" "Yes." Franz, astonished, advanced a step. "To me, sir?" said he. "Yes." Franz took them from Barrois, and casting a glance at the cover, read, "To be given after my death to General Durand, who shall bequeath the packet to his son, with an injunction to preserve it as containing an important document." "Well, sir," asked Franz, "what do you wish me to do with this paper?" "To preserve it, sealed up as it is, doubtless," said the procureur. "No," replied Noirtier eagerly. "Do you wish him to read it?" said Valentine. "Yes," replied the old man. "You understand, Baron, my grandfather wishes you to read this paper," said Valentine. "Then let us sit down," said Villefort impatiently, "for it would take some time." "Sit down," said the old man. Villefort took a chair, but Valentine remained standing by her father's side, and Franz before him, holding the mysterious paper in his hand. "Read," said the old man. Franz untied it, and in the midst of the most profound silence read, Extract from the report of a meeting of the Bonapartist Club in the Rue Saint-Jacques, held February 5th, 1815. Franz stopped. February 5th, 1815? said he. It is the day my father was murdered. Valentine and Villefort were dumb. The eye of the old man alone seemed to say clearly, "Go on." "But it was on leaving this club," said he, "my father disappeared." Noirtier's eyes continued to say, "Read." He resumed. "The undersigned Louis-Jacques Beaupère, Lieutenant Colonel of Artillery, Etienne d'Auchampy, General of the Brigade, and Claude Lecharpal, Keeper of the Woods and Forests, declare that on the 4th of February a letter arrived from the island of Elba, recommending to the kindness and the confidence of the Bonapartist Club General Flavien de Quesnel, who, having served the Emperor from 1804 to 1814, was supposed to be devoted to the interests of the Napoleon dynasty, notwithstanding the title of Baron, which Louis XVIII had just granted to him with his estate of Épinay. A note was in consequence addressed to General de Quesnel, begging him to be present at the meeting next day, the 5th. The note indicated neither the street nor the number of the house where the meeting was to be held. It bore no signature, but it announced to the general that someone would call for him if he would be ready at 9 o'clock. The meetings were always held from that time till midnight. At 9 o'clock the president of the club presented himself. The general was ready. The president informed him that one of the conditions of his introduction was that he should be eternally ignorant of the place of the meeting, and that he would allow his eyes to be bandaged, swearing that he would not endeavour to take off the bandage. General de Quesnel accepted the condition, and promised on his honour not to seek to discover the road they took. The general's carriage was ready, but the president told him it was impossible for him to use it, since it was useless to blindfold the master if the coachman knew through what streets he went. "What must be done, then?" asked the general. "I have my carriage here," said the president. "Have you then so much confidence in your servant that you can entrust him with a secret you will not allow me to know?" "Our coachman is a member of the club," said the president. "We shall be driven by a state councillor." "Then we run another risk," said the general, laughing, "that of being upset." We insert this joke to prove that the general was not in the least compelled to attend the meeting, but that he came willingly. When they were seated in the carriage, the president reminded the general of his promise to allow his eyes to be bandaged, to which he made no opposition. On the road, the president thought he saw the general make an attempt to remove the handkerchief, and reminded him of his oath. "Sure enough," said the general. The carriage stopped at an alley leading out of the Rue Saint-Jacques. The general alighted, leaning on the arm of the president, of whose dignity he was not aware, considering him simply as a member of the club. They went through the alley, mounted a flight of stairs, and entered the assembly room. The deliberations had already begun. The members, apprised of the sort of presentation which was to be made that evening, were all in attendance. When, in the middle of the room, the general was invited to remove his bandage, he did so immediately, and was surprised to see so many well-known faces in a society of whose existence he had till then been ignorant. They questioned him as to his sentiments, but he contented himself with answering that the letters from the island of Elba ought to have informed them. Franz interrupted himself by saying, "My father was a royalist. They need not have asked his sentiments, which were well known." "And hence," said Villefort, "arose my affection for your father, my dear Monsieur Franz. Opinions held in common are a ready bond of union." "Read again," said the old man. Franz continued. The president then sought to make him speak more explicitly, but Monsieur de Quesnel replied that he wished first to know what they wanted with him. He was then informed of the contents of the letter from the island of Elba, in which he was recommended to the club as a man who would be likely to advance the interests of their party, One paragraph spoke of the return of Bonaparte, and promised another letter and further details on the arrival of the Pharaon belonging to the shipbuilder Morel of Marseille, whose captain was entirely devoted to the Emperor. During all this time, the general on whom they thought to have relied as on a brother manifested evidently signs of discontent and repugnance. When the reading was finished, he remained silent, with knitted brows. "Well," asked the President, "what do you say to this letter, General?" "I say that it is too soon after declaring myself for Louis XVIII to break my vow in behalf of the ex-Emperor." This answer was too clear to permit of any mistake as to his sentiments. "General," said the President, "we acknowledge no King Louis XVIII or an ex-Emperor, but His Majesty the Emperor and King driven from France, which is his kingdom by violence and treason." "Excuse me, gentlemen," said the General. "You may not acknowledge Louis XVIII, but I do, as he has made me a baron and a field marshal, and I shall never forget that for these two titles I am indebted to his happy return to France." "Sir," said the President, rising with gravity, "be careful what you say. Your words clearly show us that they are deceived concerning you in the island of Elba, and have deceived us. The communication has been made to you in consequence of the confidence placed in you, and which does you honor. Now we discover our error. A title and promotion attach you to the government which we wish to overturn. We will not constrain you to help us. We enroll no one against his conscience, but we will compel you to act generously, even if you are not disposed to do so." "You could call acting generously knowing your conspiracy and not informing against you. That is what I should call becoming your accomplice. You see, I am more candid than you." "Ah, my father," said Franz, interrupting himself, "I understand now why they murdered him." Valentine could not help casting one glance toward the young man, whose filial enthusiasm it was delightful to behold. Villefort walked to and fro behind them. Noirtier watched the expression of each one, and preserved his dignified and commanding attitude. Franz returned to the manuscript and continued. "Sir," said the President, "you have been invited to join this assembly. You were not forced here. It was proposed to you to become blindfolded. You accepted. When you complied with this twofold request, you well knew we did not wish to secure the throne of Louis XVIII, or we should not take so much care to avoid the vigilance of the police. It would be conceding too much to allow you to put on a mask to aid you in the discovery of our secret, and then to remove it that you may ruin those who have confided in you. No, no, you must first say if you declare yourself for the king of a day who now reigns, or for His Majesty the Emperor." "I am a royalist," replied the general. "I have taken the oath of allegiance to Louis XVIII, and I will adhere to it." These words were followed by a general murmur, and it was evident that several of the members were discussing the propriety of making the general repent of his rashness. The President again arose, and having imposed silence, said, "Sir, you are too serious and too sensible a man not to understand the consequences of our present situation, and your candour has already dictated to us the conditions which remain for us to offer you." The general, putting his hand on his sword, exclaimed, "If you talk of honour, do not begin by disavowing its laws, and impose nothing by violence." "And you, sir," continued the President, with a calmness still more terrible than the general's anger, "I advise you not to touch your sword." The general looked around with slight uneasiness. However, he did not yield, but calling up all his fortitude, said, "I will not swear." "Then you must die," replied the President calmly. Monsieur d'Épinay became very pale. He looked round him for a second time. Several members of the club were whispering and getting their arms from under their cloaks. "General," said the President, "do not alarm yourself. You are among men of honor, who will use every means to convince you before resorting to the last extremity. But as you have said you are among conspirators, you are in possession of our secret, and you must restore it to us." A significant silence followed these words, and as the general did not reply, "Close the doors," said the President to the doorkeeper. The same deadly silence succeeded these words. Then the general advanced, and making a violent effort to control his feelings, "I have a son," said he, "and I ought to think of him, finding myself among assassins." "General," said the chief of the assembly, "one man may insult 50. It is the privilege of weakness, but he does wrong to use his privilege. Follow my advice. Swear, and do not insult." The general, again daunted by the superiority of the chief, hesitated a moment, then advancing to the president's desk, "What is the form?" said he. "It is this: I swear by my honor not to reveal to anyone what I have seen and heard on the 5th of February, 1815, between 9 and 10 o'clock in the evening, and I plead guilty of death should I ever violate this oath." The general appeared to be affected by a nervous tremor, which prevented his answering for some moments. Then, overcoming his manifest repugnance, he pronounced the required oath, but in so low a tone as to be scarcely audible to the majority of the members, who insisted on his repeating it clearly and distinctly, which he did. "Now, am I at liberty to retire?" said the general. The President arose, appointed 3 members to accompany him, and got into the carriage with the general after bandaging his eyes. One of those 3 members was the coachman who had driven them there. The other members silently dispersed. "Where do you wish to be taken?" asked the President. "Anywhere out of your presence," replied Monsieur d'Épinay. "Beware, sir," replied the President. "You are no longer in the Assembly, and have only to do with individuals. Do not insult them unless you wish to be held responsible." But instead of listening, Monsieur d'Épinay went on. "You are still as brave in your carriage as in your Assembly, because you are still 4 against 1. The President stopped the coach. They were at the part of the Quai des Ormes where the steps lead down to the river. "Why do you stop here?" asked d'Épinay. "Because, sir," said the President, "you have insulted a man, and that man will not go one step farther without demanding honorable reparation." "Another method of assassination," said the general, shrugging his shoulders. "Make no noise, sir, unless you wish me to consider you as one of the men of whom you spoke just now as cowards, who take their weakness for a shield. You are alone. One alone shall answer you. You have a sword by your side. I have one in my cane. You have no witness. One of these gentlemen will serve you. Now, if you please, remove your bandage." The general tore the handkerchief from his eyes. "At last," said he, "I shall know with whom I have to do." They opened the door, and the 4 men alighted. Franz again interrupted himself and wiped the cold drops from his brow. There was something awful in hearing the son read aloud in trembling pallor these details of his father's death, which had hitherto been a mystery. Valentine clasped her hands as if in prayer. Noirtier looked at Villefort with an almost sublime expression of contempt and pride. Franz continued. "It was, as we said, the 5th of February. For 3 days the mercury had been 5 or 6 degrees below freezing, and the steps were covered with ice. The general was stout and tall. The President offered him the side of the railing to assist him in getting down. The 2 witnesses followed. It was a dark night. The ground from the steps to the river was covered with snow and hoarfrost. The water of the river looked black and deep. One of the seconds went for a lantern in a coal barge near, and by its light they examined the weapons. The President's sword, which was simply, as he had said, one he carried in his cane, was 5 inches shorter than the General's and had no guard. The General proposed to cast lots for the swords, but the President said it was he who had given the provocation, and when he had given it, he had supposed each would use his own arms. The witnesses endeavoured to insist, but the President bade them be silent. The lantern was placed on the ground. The 2 adversaries took their stations, and the duel began. The light made the 2 swords appear like flashes of lightning. As for the men, they were scarcely perceptible. The darkness was so great. General d'Épinay passed for one of the best swordsmen in the army, but he was pressed so closely in the onset that he missed his aim and fell. The witnesses thought he was dead, but his adversary, who knew he had not struck him, offered him the assistance of his hand to rise. The circumstance irritated instead of calming the general, and he rushed on his adversary. But his opponent did not allow his guard to be broken. He received him on his sword, and 3 times the general drew back on finding himself too closely engaged, and then returned to the charge. At the 3rd, he fell again. They thought he slipped, as at first, and the witnesses, seeing he did not move, approached and endeavoured to raise him. But the one who passed his arm around the body found it was moistened with blood. The general, who had almost fainted, revived. "Ah," said he, "they have sent some fencing master to fight with me." The President, without answering, approached the witness who held the lantern, and raising his sleeve, showed him 2 wounds he had received in his arm. Then opening his coat and unbuttoning his waistcoat, displayed his side, pierced with a 3rd wound. Still, he had not even uttered a sigh. General d'Épinay died 5 minutes after. Franz read these last words in a voice so choked that they were hardly audible, and then stopped, passing his hand over his eyes as if to dispel a cloud. But after a moment's silence, he continued. The President went up the steps, after pushing his sword into his cane. A track of blood on the snow marked his course. He had scarcely arrived at the top when he heard a heavy splash in the water. It was the general's body, which the witnesses had just thrown into the river, after ascertaining that he was dead. The general fell, then, in a loyal duel, and not in ambush, as it might have been reported. In proof of this, we have signed this paper to establish the truth of the facts, lest the moment should arrive when either of the actors in this terrible scene should be accused of premeditated murder or of infringement of the laws of honour. Signed, Beaurepaire, Deschamps, and Le Charpal. When Franz had finished reading this account, so dreadful for a son, when Valentine, pale with emotion, had wiped away a tear, when Villefort, trembling and crouched in a corner, had endeavoured to lessen the storm by supplicating glances at the implacable old man. "Sir," said d'Épinay to Noirtier, "since you are well acquainted with all these details, which are attested by honourable signatures, since you appear to take some interest in me, although you have only manifested it hitherto by causing me sorrow, refuse me not one final satisfaction. Tell me the name of the president of the club, that I may at least know who killed my father." Villefort mechanically felt for the handle of the door. Valentine, who understood sooner than anyone her grandfather's answer, and who had often seen 2 scars upon his right arm, drew back a few steps. "Mademoiselle," said Franz, returning towards Valentine, "unite your efforts with mine to find out the name of the man who made me an orphan at 2 years of age." Valentine remained dumb and motionless. "Hold, sir," said Villefort. "Do not prolong this dreadful scene. The names have been purposely concealed. My father himself does not know who his president was, and if he knows, he cannot tell you. Proper names are not in the dictionary." "Oh, misery!" cried Franz. "The only hope which sustained me and enabled me to read to the end was that of knowing at least the name of him who killed my father. Sir, sir," cried he, turning to Noirtier, "do what you can. Make me understand in some way." "Yes," replied Noirtier. "Oh, mademoiselle, mademoiselle!" cried Franz. "Your grandfather says he can indicate the person. Help me. Lend me your assistance." Noirtier looked at the dictionary. Franz took it with a nervous trembling and repeated the letters of the alphabet successfully, until he came to M. At that letter the old man signified yes. "M," repeated Franz. The young man's finger glided over the words, but at each one Noirtier answered by a negative sign. Valentine hid her head between her hands. At length Franz arrived at the word. "Myself." "Yes." "You!" cried Franz, whose hair stood on end. "You, Monsieur Noirtier! You killed my father?" "Yes," replied Noirtier, fixing a majestic look on the young man. Franz fell powerless on a chair. Villefort opened the door and escaped, for the idea had entered his mind to stifle the little remaining life in the heart of this terrible old man. End of chapter 75. Chapter 76. Progress of Cavalcanti the Younger. Meanwhile, Monsieur Cavalcanti the Elder had returned to his service, not in the army of His Majesty the Emperor of Austria, but at the gaming table of the Baths of Lucca, of which he was one of the most assiduous courtiers. He had spent every farthing that had been allowed for his journey as a reward for the majestic and solemn manner in which he had maintained his assumed character of father. Monsieur Andrea, at his departure, inherited all the papers which proved that he had indeed the honour of being the son of the Marquis Bartolomeo and the Marchioness Oliva Corsinari. He was now fairly launched in that Parisian society which gives such ready access to foreigners, and treats them not as they really are, but as they wish to be considered. Besides, what is required of a young man in Paris? To speak its language tolerably, to make a good appearance, to be a good gamester, and to pay in cash. They are certainly less particular with a foreigner than with a Frenchman. Andrea had then in a fortnight attained a very fair position. He was called Count. He was said to possess 50,000 livres per annum, and his father's immense riches, buried in the quarries of Saravezza, were a constant theme. A learned man, before whom the last circumstance was mentioned as a fact, declared he had seen the quarries in question, which gave great weight to assertions hitherto somewhat doubtful, but which now assumed the garb of reality. Such was the state of society in Paris at the period we bring before our readers, when Monte Cristo went one evening to pay Monsieur Danglars a visit. Monsieur Danglars was out, but the Count was asked to go and see the Baroness, and he accepted the invitation. It was never without a nervous shudder since the dinner at Auteuil, and the events which followed it, that Madame Danglars heard Monte Cristo's name announced. If he did not come, the painful sensation became most intense. If, on the contrary, he appeared, his noble countenance, his brilliant eyes, his amiability, his polite attention even towards Madame Danglars, soon dispelled every impression of fear. It appeared impossible to the Baroness that a man of such delightfully pleasing manners should entertain evil designs against her. Besides, the most corrupt minds only suspect evil when it would answer some interested end. Useless injury is repugnant to every mind. When Monte Cristo entered the boudoir, to which we have already once introduced our readers, and where the Baroness was examining some drawings which her daughter passed to her after having looked at them with Monsieur Cavalcanti, his presence soon produced its usual effect, and it was with smiles that the Baroness received the Count. Although she had been a little disconcerted at the announcement of his name, the latter took in the whole scene at a glance. The Baroness was partially reclining on a sofa. Eugénie sat near her, and Cavalcanti was standing. Cavalcanti, dressed in black like one of Goethe's heroes, with varnished shoes and white silk open-worked stockings, passed a white and tolerably nice-looking hand through his light hair, and so displayed a sparkling diamond, that in spite of Monte Cristo's advice, the vain young man had been unable to resist putting on his little finger. This movement was accompanied by killing glances at Mademoiselle Danglars, and by sighs launched in the same direction. Mademoiselle Danglars was still the same, cold, beautiful, and satirical. Not one of these glances, nor one sigh, was lost on her. They might have been said to fall on the shield of Minerva, which some philosophers assert protected sometimes the breast of Sappho. Eugénie bowed coldly to the Count, and availed herself of the first moment when the conversation became earnest to escape to her study, whence very soon two cheerful and noisy voices, being heard in connection with occasional notes of the piano, assured Monte Cristo that Mademoiselle Danglars preferred to his society and to that of Monsieur Cavalcanti the company of Mademoiselle Louise d'Armilly, her singing teacher. It was then, especially while conversing with Madame Danglars, and apparently absorbed by the charm of the conversation, that the Count noticed Monsieur Andrea Cavalcanti's solicitude, his manner of listening to the music at the door he dared not pass, and of manifesting his admiration. The banker soon returned. His first look was certainly directed towards Monte Cristo, but the second was for Andrea. As for his wife, he bowed to her, as some husbands do to their wives, but in a way that bachelors will never comprehend, until a very extensive code is published on conjugal life. "Have not the ladies invited you to join them at the piano?" said Danglars to Andrea. "Alas, no, sir," replied Andrea with a sigh, still more remarkable than the former ones. Danglars immediately advanced towards the door and opened it. The two young ladies were seen seated on the same chair at the piano, accompanying themselves each with one hand, a fancy to which they had accustomed themselves, and performed admirably. Mademoiselle d'Armilly, whom they then perceived through the open doorway, formed with Eugénie one of the tableaux vivants of which the Germans are so fond. She was somewhat beautiful and exquisitely formed, a little fairy-like figure with large curls falling on her neck, which was rather too long, as Perugino sometimes makes his virgins, and her eyes dull from fatigue. She was said to have a weak chest, and like Antonia in the Cremona violin, she would die one day while singing. Monte Cristo cast one rapid and curious glance round this sanctum. It was the first time he had ever seen Mademoiselle d'Armilly, of whom he had heard much. "Well," said the banker to his daughter, "are we then all to be excluded?" He then led the young man into the study, and either by chance or manoeuvre the door was partially closed after Andrea, so that from the place where they sat neither the Count nor the Baroness could see anything. But as the banker had accompanied Andrea, Madame Danglars appeared to take no notice of it. The Count soon heard Andrea's voice, singing a Corsican song accompanied by the piano. While the Count smiled at hearing this song, which made him lose sight of Andrea, in the recollection of Benedetto, Madame Danglars was boasting to Monte Cristo of her husband's strength of mind, who that very morning had lost 300,000 or 400,000 francs by a failure at Milan. The praise was well deserved, for had not the Count heard it from the Baroness, or by one of these means by which he knew everything, the Baron's countenance would not have led him to suspect it. Thought Monte Cristo, he begins to conceal his losses. A month since he boasted of them. And then aloud, "Oh, madame, Monsieur Danglars is so skilful. He will soon regain at the Bourse what he loses elsewhere." "I see that you participate in a prevalent error," said Madame Danglars. "What is it?" said Monte Cristo. "That Monsieur Danglars speculates, whereas he never does." "Truly, madame, I recollect Monsieur Debray told me, apropos, what is become of him. I have seen nothing of him the last 3 or 4 days." "Nor I," said Madame Danglars. "But you began a sentence, sir, and did not finish." "Which?" "Monsieur Debray had told you." "Ah, yes, he told me it was you who sacrificed to the demon of speculation." "I was once very fond of it, but I do not indulge now." "Then you are wrong, madame. Fortune is precarious, and if I were a woman and fate had made me a banker's wife, whatever might be my confidence in my husband's good fortune, still in speculation you know there is great risk. Well, I would secure for myself a fortune independent of him, even if I acquired it by placing my interests in hands unknown to him." Madame Danglars blushed in spite of all her efforts. "Stay," said Monte Cristo, as though he had not observed her confusion. "I have heard of a lucky hit that was made yesterday on the Neapolitan bonds." "I have none, nor have I ever possessed any. But really, we have talked long enough of money, Count. We are like 2 stockbrokers. Have you heard how fate is persecuting the poor Villeforts?" "What has happened?" said the Count, simulating total ignorance. "You know the Marquis of Saint-Méran died a few days after he had set out on his journey to Paris, and the Marchioness a few days after her arrival." "Yes," said Monte Cristo, "I have heard that. But as Claudius said to Hamlet, 'It is a law of nature, their fathers died before them, and they mourned their loss. They will die before their children, who will in their turn grieve for them.'" "But that is not all." "Not all?" "No, they were going to marry their daughter—" "To Monsieur Franz d'Épinay. Is it broken off?" "Yesterday morning, it appears. Franz declined the honour." "Indeed. And is the reason known?" "No." "How extraordinary! And how does Monsieur de Villefort bear it?" "As usual, like a philosopher." Danglars returned at this moment alone. "Well," said the Baroness, "do you leave Monsieur Cavalcanti with your daughter?" "And Mademoiselle d'Armilly," said the banker. "Do you consider her no one?" Then turning to Monte Cristo, he said, "Prince Cavalcanti is a charming young man, is he not? But is he really a prince?" "I will not answer for it," said Monte Cristo. "His father was introduced to me as a marquis, so he ought to be a count. But I do not think he has much claim to that title." "Why?" said the banker. "If he is a prince, he is wrong not to maintain his rank. I do not like anyone to deny his origin." "Oh, you are a thorough democrat," said Monte Cristo, smiling. "But do you see to what you are exposing yourself?" said the Baroness. "If perchance Monsieur de Morcerf came, he would find Monsieur Cavalcanti in that room where he, the betrothed of Eugénie, has never been admitted." "You may well say perchance," replied the banker, "for he comes so seldom. It would seem only chance that brings him." "But should he come and find that young man with your daughter? He might be displeased." "He? You are mistaken. Monsieur Albert would not do us the honour to be jealous. He does not like Eugénie sufficiently. Besides, I care not for his displeasure." "Still, situated as we are—" "Yes. Do you know how we are situated? At his mother's ball he danced one with Eugénie and Monsieur Cavalcanti 3 times, and he took no notice of it." The valet announced the Vicomte Albert de Morcerf. The Baroness rose hastily and was going to the study when Danglars stopped her. "Let her alone," said he. She looked at him in amazement. Monte Cristo appeared to be unconscious of what passed. Albert entered, looking very handsome and in high spirits. He bowed politely to the Baroness, familiarly to Danglars, and affectionately to Monte Cristo. Then turning to the Baroness, "May I ask how Mademoiselle Danglars is?" said he. "She is quite well," replied Danglars quickly. "She is at the piano with Monsieur Cavalcanti." Albert retained his calm and indifferent manner. He might feel perhaps annoyed, but he knew Monte Cristo's eye was on him. "Monsieur Cavalcanti has a fine tenor voice," said he, "and Mademoiselle Eugénie a splendid soprano, and then she plays the piano like a Thalberg. The concert must be a delightful one." "They suit each other remarkably well," said Danglars. Albert appeared not to notice this remark, which was, however, so rude that Madame Danglars blushed. "I, too," said the young man, "am a musician. At least, my masters used to tell me so. But it is strange that my voice never would suit any other, and the soprano less than any." Danglars smiled, and seemed to say, "It is of no consequence." Then, hoping doubtless to effect his purpose, he said, "The prince and my daughter were universally admired yesterday. You were not of the party, Monsieur de Morcerf." "What prince?" asked Albert. "Prince Cavalcanti," said Danglars, who persisted in giving the young man that title. "Pardon me," said Albert. "I was not aware that he was a prince. And Prince Cavalcanti sang with Mademoiselle Eugénie yesterday? It must have been charming. Indeed, I regret not having heard them, but I was unable to accept your invitation, having promised to accompany my mother to a German concert given by the Baroness of Château Renaud." This was followed by rather an awkward silence. "May I also be allowed," said Morcerf, "to pay my respects to Mademoiselle Danglars?" "Wait a moment," said the banker, stopping the young man. "Do you hear that delightful cavatina? Ta-ta-ta, ti-ta-ta, ta-ta. It is charming. Let them finish. One moment. Bravi, bravi, brava." The banker was enthusiastic in his applause. "Indeed," said Albert, "it is exquisite. It is impossible to understand the music of his country better than Prince Cavalcanti does. You said prince, did you not? But he can easily become one, if he is not already. It is no uncommon thing in Italy. But to return to the charming musicians, you should give us a treat, Danglars, without telling them there is a stranger. Ask them to sing one more song. It is so delightful to hear music, in the distance, when the musicians are unrestrained by observation." Danglars was quite annoyed by the young man's indifference. He took Monte Cristo aside. "What do you think of her lover?" said he. "He appears cool. But then your word is given." "Yes, doubtless. I have promised to give my daughter to a man who loves her, but not to one who does not. See him there, cold as marble and proud like his father. If he were rich, if he had Cavalcanti's fortune, that might be pardoned. Ma foi! I haven't consulted my daughter, but if she has good taste—" "Oh," said Monte Cristo, "my fondness may blind me, but I assure you I consider Morcerf a charming young man, who will render your daughter happy and will sooner or later attain a certain amount of distinction. And his father's position is good." Said Danglars. "Why do you doubt?" "The past. That obscurity of the past. But that does not affect the son." "Very true." "Now, I beg of you, don't go off your head. It's a month now that you have been thinking of this marriage, and you must see that it throws some responsibility on me, for it was at my house you met this young Cavalcanti, whom I do not really know at all." "But I do." "Have you made inquiry?" "Is there any need of that? Does not his appearance speak for him? And he is very rich." "I am not so sure of that." "And yet you said he had money." 50,000 livres. A mere trifle." "He is well educated." said Monte Cristo in his turn. "He is a musician." "So are all the Italians." "Come, Count, you do not do that young man justice." "Well, I acknowledge it annoys me, knowing your connection with the Morcerf family, to see him throw himself in the way." Danglars burst out laughing. "What a Puritan you are!" said he. "That happens every day." "But you cannot break it off in this way. The Morcerfs are depending on this union." "Indeed?" "Positively." "Then let them explain themselves. You should give the father a hint. You are so intimate with the family." "I? Where the devil did you find out that?" "At their ball. It was apparent enough. Why, did not the Countess, the proud Mercedes, the disdainful Catalan, who will scarcely open her lips to her oldest acquaintances, take your arm, lead you into the garden, into the private walks, and remain there for half an hour?" "Ah, Baron, Baron," said Albert, "you are not listening. What barbarism in a megalomaniac like you!" "Oh, don't worry about me, Sir Mocker," said Danglars. Then turning to the Count, he said, "But will you undertake to speak to the father?" "Willingly, if you wish it." "But let it be done explicitly and positively. If he demands my daughter, let him fix the day. Declare his conditions. In short, let us either understand each other or quarrel. You understand? No more delay." "Yes, sir, I will give my attention to the subject." "I do not say that I await with pleasure his decision, but I do await it. A banker must, you know, be a slave to his promise." And Danglars sighed as Monsieur Cavalcanti had done half an hour before. "Bravi, bravo, bravard!" cried Morcerf, parodying the banker, as the selection came to an end. Danglars began to look suspiciously at Morcerf, when someone came and whispered a few words to him. "I shall soon return," said the banker to Monte Cristo. "Wait for me. I shall perhaps have something to say to you." And he went out. The Baroness took advantage of her husband's absence to push open the door of her daughter's study, and Monsieur Andrea, who was sitting before the piano with Mademoiselle Eugénie, started up like a jack-in-the-box. Albert bowed with a smile to Mademoiselle Danglars, who did not appear in the least disturbed, and returned his bow with her usual coolness. Cavalcanti was evidently embarrassed. He bowed to Morcerf, who replied with the most impertinent look possible. Then Albert launched out in praise of Mademoiselle Danglars' voice, and on his regret, after what he had just heard, that he had been unable to be present the previous evening. Cavalcanti, being left alone, turned to Monte Cristo. "Come," said Madame Danglars, "leave music and compliments, and let us go and take tea." "Come, Louise," said Mademoiselle Danglars to her friend. They passed into the next drawing-room, where tea was prepared. Just as they were beginning, in the English fashion, to leave the spoons in their cups, the door again opened, and Danglars entered, visibly agitated. Monte Cristo observed it particularly, and by a look asked the banker for an explanation. "I have just received my courier from Greece," said Danglars. "Ah, yes," said the Count, "and that was the reason of your running away from us." "Yes." "How is King Otto getting on?" asked Albert in the most sprightly tone. Danglars cast a suspicious look towards him without answering, and Monte Cristo turned away to conceal the expression of pity which passed over his features, but which had gone in a moment. "We shall go together, shall we not?" said Albert to the Count. "If you like," replied the latter. Albert could not understand the banker's look, and turned to Monte Cristo, who understood it perfectly. "Did you see," said he, "how he looked at me?" "Yes," said the Count. "But did you think there was anything particular in his look?" "Indeed I did. And what does he mean by his news from Greece?" "How can I tell you?" "Because I imagine you have correspondence in that country." Monte Cristo smiled significantly. "Stop," said Albert. "Here he comes. I shall compliment Mademoiselle Danglars on her cameo while the father talks to you." "If you compliment her at all, let it be on her voice at least," said Monte Cristo. "No, every one would do that." "My dear Viscount, you are dreadfully impertinent." Albert advanced towards Eugénie, smiling. Meanwhile Danglars, stooping to Monte Cristo's ear, "Your advice was excellent," said he. "There is a whole history connected with the name Fernand and Janina." "Indeed," said Monte Cristo. "Yes, I will tell you all. But take away the young man. I cannot endure his presence." "He is going with me. Shall I send the father to you?" "Immediately." "Very well." The Count made a sign to Albert, and they bowed to the ladies and took their leave, Albert perfectly indifferent to Mademoiselle Danglars' contempt, Monte Cristo reiterating his advice to Madame Danglars on the prudence a banker's wife should exercise in providing for the future. Monsieur Cavalcanti remained master of the field. End of chapter 76.
All right. So we've gotten some important intel in our chapters today, especially 74 and 75. The first of which is, did you catch the date for when Villefort's first wife, Valentine's mom, died? The mention was it's been 10 years since Renée, Valentine's mom, had died. That means that Villefort's affair with pre-Madame Danglars occurred while he was still married to Valentine's mother. So there is another mark to put against Villefort. Also, I was kind of surprised how obvious the dichotomy was between how kind Franz was being and kind of, wow, she's still in mourning. We can take it easy, dude, versus Villefort. And what a striking juxtaposition that was. And I can't help but think that some of that was Dumas trying to remind us that Villefort wasn't just responsible for putting Edmond into prison unjustly, super unjustly, but that Villefort has a lifetime of things that he has done that are, if not reprehensible, at least deeply morally questionable. The chapters that we had between Villefort and Madame Danglars, those were very sad. And we got to see the inside of just how hard Villefort worked to try and find his lost son. And you kind of can't help but feel for the guy after those chapters. And I think Dumas had been reminded that he needed to remind us of all of the things that make the Count's pursuit of justice, divine type justice, matter. And as soon as you heard the phrase letters from Elba, did your ears perk up? Because all of a sudden, all of the things fall into place. We knew that Noirtier was involved in the murder-ish of someone, and we were able to put the someone pieces together as well before this chapter. But now we get the whole story, and Franz has to read it aloud, which I thought was pretty brutal. And I love Noirtier for his interactions with Valentine and how much he cares for her and how much she obviously cares for him. Also, that would have been based in part on his pre-stroke self. And by that, I mean that their relationship, her love for him, isn't just one based on, oh, my poor grandfather, I'm the only one who can talk to him. Me, I guess I'll have to stick around and help him out. But that they had a relationship, some kind of deeply loving relationship before that happened. And her devotion to him is built on that. So it makes it that much more interesting to see places where Noirtier is perhaps not so loving or generous and can be very much the way that his son can be. And then as the palate cleanser for you, I included chapter 76, which is kind of a one-off. It was, I don't know, to me, it came across as kind of a comic relief chapter. I'm starting to get the sense, though, that Dumas more and more is treating Danglars as kind of a comic relief character. He is often made to appear kind of dim and ridiculous. He doesn't seem to get any jokes, that kind of thing. And at first I thought that was kind of odd because he'd been such a nasty character in the beginning, so sneering and just yuck. But then I thought, no, because even in the beginning, he is really just a small, petty man. There is nothing that says anything about him other than financial ambition. It's not like he wants to do anything with the money. He doesn't want to travel more. He doesn't want to see more or know more. He just wants money to collect it. And he has continued to be that guy. He knows no more. He is no better read. He knows nothing more about art except that you are supposed to collect it. And this is what guys like that grow up to be, I guess, in Dumas' eyes. So he does, in some ways, become this pathetic, ridiculous, middle-aged character. But his ridiculousness does not in any way excuse his avarice and greed and his treatment of Edmond. And that is where we will leave it. The Count and Albert, Cavalcante and Danglars, and those chess pieces are being set up a little bit more this week. Next week, we will, like I said, switch and catch up on another character who we haven't heard much from for a while. Thanks for listening. Don't forget, for 20% off of your first 2 orders that are over $35 each, visit jet.com and enter promotional code CRAFTLIT during your checkout. Terms and conditions apply. See jet.com for details and have a great time shopping. Oh, and did I mention they have arts and craft supplies? They have everything supplies. It is not just food. You really will not believe the amount of stuff that they have available for you on their website. And I actually have pictures of my screenshots and of my most recent order from jet.com in the show notes at craftlit.com/454. All right. Thank you so much. Thank you for supporting our sponsor this week. And I will talk to you next week with your voicemails and your emails in their proper position. Thank you. Have a great one. I'll talk to you soon. Bye. A big thanks to all the Craftlit listeners who support the show by being a premium audio member via craftlit.com/premium or via patreon.com/craftlit. Your support for the show is what's kept us going since 2006. If you feel like getting free audio pretty much every week, please consider supporting the show by heading over to patreon.com/craftlit and pledging what you feel the show is worth to you. If you can't support the show that way, consider leaving a review at iTunes or at our facebook.com/craftlit page, or follow at Craftlit on Twitter and share the show with your followers too. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on.